Somewhere in Siberia at 2 in the morning, in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in 20 minutes, a truck driver is filming himself on his phone. He is not filming a war, he is not filming a protest, he is filming a line of trucks that stretches so far into the darkness that his headlights never find the end of it. And when he finally speaks, he does not sound like a man in a country that is winning anything. He sounds like a man who has given up pretending. He curses the government. He curses the state television that keeps telling him everything is fine, and then he goes quiet because there is nothing left to do but wait. That video is not an isolated rant. It is one tiny piece of a machine that is grinding to a halt across 11 time zones. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why a stalled truck in the middle of nowhere in Russia might be the single most important economic story of the year. Because here is the thing nobody in the Kremlin wants you to notice. Russia is not just a country. It is a supply line, 11 time zones of it, held together by exactly one thing, asphalt and diesel. Take that away, even partially, and you do not get a bad news cycle. You get a country that cannot feed itself, cannot arm itself, and cannot move itself. And that is precisely what is happening right now. Let's start with the part they can't hide, because it's on video. In the Siberian city of Chita, a trucker filmed a line of vehicles waiting for fuel that stretched, in his words, farther than his eyes could see, well past midnight. In Zabaikalsky Krai, another driver, filming his own stranded rig, unloaded a stream of curses directed straight at the Russian government, mocking the idea that state television keeps showing a country where, in his words, everything is supposedly amazing. That clip has been circulating with drivers commenting from as far as Samarkand and Khujand, sharing their own version of the same nightmare. This is not one bad week in one bad region. This is a pattern, and patterns are what tell you a system is breaking. So how bad does a fuel shortage have to get before a grown man abandons his job in the middle of a Siberian highway? Try this. One driver was stuck in a fuel line in Siberia for 39 hours. 39 hours, waiting to fill a tank, engine off to save what little fuel he had left, watching the temperature outside and the patience inside both drop to zero. Some drivers never made it to the pump at all. They simply walked away, left their trucks, left the cargo inside them, and abandoned everything on the shoulder of the highway. Traffic police are now stationed at some of these fuel lines, not to direct traffic, but to stop desperate drivers from cutting the line, because after days of waiting, people are furious enough to fight over a tank of diesel. And this is where it stops being a trucking story and starts being a food story. In the middle of harvest season, a Russian farmer posted a video revolting against the fact that he could not find fuel for his combine harvester. His warning was almost biblical in how blunt it was. He said they might soon be forced to bring in the harvest by hand with sickles like medieval serfs. Sit with that for a second. A modern nuclear superpower and one of its own farmers is talking about harvesting grain with a hand tool because there is no diesel for the machine that is supposed to do it. Follow that thread and you can already see where it goes. Trucks stop moving, crops rot in the fields because there's no way to get them to market. Store shelves start thinning out. Prices start climbing. It's already happening. The price of something as ordinary as a bag of coffee has doubled in just a few months, and that's the visible tip of something far bigger and far uglier that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Here's the number that should genuinely alarm you. Russian economists estimate that at least 35% of the country's trucking companies are currently teetering on the edge of outright bankruptcy. Not struggling, not slowing down, on the edge of collapse. To understand what that actually means, you need to understand the scale we're talking about. There are close to 500,000 registered trucking companies and independent owner-operators in Russia. 500,000 businesses responsible for moving food, fuel, and goods across the largest country on earth. If more than a third of that fleet goes under, you are not looking at a rough patch for an industry. You are looking at hundreds of thousands of businesses standing on the edge of an abyss, all at the same time. And here's the part that makes it so much worse. This industry was already bleeding before the fuel crisis even started. According to the Russian business daily Izvestia, roughly 7,000 logistics companies had already entered bankruptcy or liquidation before 2025 was even over. That was already the highest number in 17 years. In other words, the cracking sound was already there before the avalanche hit. Sky-high interest rates, surging costs, shrinking margins. The industry was limping long before the fuel shortage delivered what analysts fear could be a finishing blow. Some of the more conservative estimates now suggest that more than 7% of all trucking companies in Russia could disappear from the market entirely within 2026. This isn't a forecast anymore. It's already visible on the ground. The smallest, most fragile operators are the first to go. Some have already suspended their long-distance routes entirely because the costs and the fuel instability simply made the math impossible. And it's trickling down into daily life in ways ordinary people actually feel. In cities like Lipetsk, courier and delivery services are already breaking down because of the fuel shortage. This is the chain reaction in real time, a shortage that starts with massive freight companies and ends with a package that never shows up at your door. So what actually broke this system? It wasn't one single event. It was 4 separate pressures slamming into the same industry at the same time. First, the money stopped making sense. Freight rates, What truckers actually get paid to move goods dropped. Meanwhile, operating costs went the opposite direction, straight up. To fight war-driven inflation, Russia's central bank hiked interest rates all the way up to 21%, which means if you're a small trucking operator and your rig is falling apart, good luck getting a loan to replace it. For smaller operators, that door basically closed. Second, the state itself made things harder. A new scrappage fee on heavy-duty trucks, running into the millions of rubles depending on the vehicle, kicked in starting in early 2026. Imagine being told the truck you can barely afford to keep running now costs even more just to legally retire. Third, sanctions, the slow-motion kind. Spare parts for Western trucks like Scania and Volvo, which used to be the backbone of Russian freight, became almost impossible to get. So the fleet got older. And older trucks mean higher maintenance costs and more breakdowns, right when companies can least afford either. And fourth, the fuel crisis itself hit an industry that was already cornered on every side. For a trucker who's already losing money, already in debt, and already driving a truck held together with hope and spare parts, a sudden diesel shortage isn't an inconvenience, it's the final nail. Now all of that is statistics, cold numbers on a page. If you want to see what this actually looks like on the ground, you need to go to Chita, deep in Siberia, roughly 5,000 kilometers from Moscow. Chita sits directly on the Trans-Siberian route that carries the nation's east-west trade, which is exactly why this bottleneck is so visible there. Here's the math that explains why trucks specifically are getting crushed. A regular passenger car can run all day on 40 or 50 liters of gas. A semi-truck hauling tons of freight burns through hundreds of liters. When fuel is scarce, that difference in scale means long-haul freight trucks are the first to be strangled. A woman working for a logistics company in Irkutsk described several of her company's fully loaded trucks stranded for days just outside Chita because the drivers simply could not find fuel. Her comparison was chilling. She said it reminded her of stories about Soviet-era food lines. And for some drivers, being stranded wasn't even the end of the story. One trucker posted a video explaining that his journey, which started with a 50-ton payload, was simply over. He said he had no intention of rotting on the side of the road waiting for fuel that might never come. So he did what a growing number of drivers are doing. He abandoned the rig, cargo and all, right there on the highway shoulder and walked away. Think about what's actually sitting inside that trailer. Raw materials a factory is waiting on, a supermarket's entire weekly inventory, all of it just orphaned in the middle of nowhere. This crisis is hitting hardest along Russia's single most important trade corridor, the route to China. Logistics companies speaking to the business daily Kommersant say daily mileage on the China route has dropped from 600 or 700 kilometers a day down to just 500, purely because of time lost in fuel lines. A single stop at a gas station can now add a full day to a delivery. And the cost is brutal. The price of sending a single truck from Manzhouli, China, all the way to Moscow has rocketed to nearly $10,000. And according to the people running these routes, that number is not done climbing. All of this instability is producing the most dangerous outcome of all. Drivers are starting to say no. If you don't know whether you'll find fuel along the route, why take the risk? Independent truck owners are increasingly refusing long-haul dispatches altogether, sticking to short trips of 100 or 150 kilometers where they know they can make it back. Some carriers are rejecting freight orders entirely. And here's the trap hiding inside that decision. Even if fuel supply improves tomorrow, there may not be enough drivers left willing to take the wheel and not enough companies left willing to accept the loads. The crisis starts feeding itself. So why does a bottleneck in a handful of distant cities threaten an entire nation? Because there is only one spine holding Russia's east and west together, the Trans-Siberian corridor. It's the longest railway on Earth, roughly 10,000 kilometers, and it alone carries more than half of Russia's entire foreign trade. And there is no backup, none. That single fact is what makes this whole system so fragile. Look at where Russia's trade actually goes now. Cut off from Western markets by sanctions, Russia has tied its economic survival almost entirely to one country, one China. Everything from electronics to auto parts pours in through this one eastern gateway. Trade between the two countries hit an all-time record in 2024, or $245 billion, and Russian officials have publicly celebrated that number. But nearly all of that overland trade depends on one crossing point, Zabaikalsk-Manzhouli, the busiest land border checkpoint between the two nations. That single crossing is under so much strain that Russia and China have already agreed to build an entirely second railway line just to relieve the pressure, which tells you everything. A fuel line in Chita is never just a local problem. The cargo idling in that line is being waited on by a factory assembly line or a supermarket warehouse thousands of miles away. You might be asking, if the highways are this broken, why not just move everything onto the railways instead? Two reasons that one, that solution doesn't work. The first is basic geography. Trains only run between major terminals. Getting goods from a warehouse to an actual store or crops from a field to a grain silo has to happen on wheels, meaning trucks. That final stretch, what the logistics world calls the last mile, is almost entirely dependent on trucking. There's no way around it. The second reason is even worse. Russia's rail network is collapsing right alongside its highways. The state rail monopoly, RZD, handles nearly 87% of all freight in the country, and it is in the middle of the worst crisis in its history. Freight volume in 2025 dropped to its lowest level in 16 years. Locomotive production has collapsed under sanctions, while at the same time, roughly 300,000 rail cars, about a fifth of the entire national fleet, are sitting uselessly gridlocked on the tracks, going nowhere. Add in debt exceeding 4 trillion rubles, and you have a rail system that is not a backup plan. It is a second collapsing system. What about the sky? Surely planes don't get stuck in fuel lines or gridlocked rail yards, except air cargo might actually be the weakest link of all. Aviation fuel prices in Russia have spiked violently, and deliveries to airports have dropped sharply. Some airlines are already warning that fuel shortages could force widespread flight cancellations. Things got so serious that the Kremlin was forced to ban jet fuel exports, the same way it banned regular gasoline exports, just to keep enough fuel for its own domestic flights. Think about that for a moment. A major energy exporting nation banning fuel exports just to keep its own planes in the air. And even beyond fuel, Russia's commercial aircraft are struggling. Sanctions cut off spare parts for Western-made Boeing and Airbus jets, so a significant chunk of the commercial fleet is grounded, with airlines forced to cannibalize parked planes just to keep the rest flying. And then there's the drone threat. Ukrainian drone strikes are forcing Russian airports to shut down operations repeatedly, making air travel even less reliable. What's left? Some freight has been rerouted through a middle corridor across the Caspian Sea and through Turkey. But that route simply does not have the capacity to absorb Russia's massive trade volume, and it's already creating bottlenecks and rising costs at the border crossings. No matter which direction you look, road, rail, or air, there is no real alternative waiting in the wings. When the trucks stop, the supply chain of an entire nation stops with them. And this isn't theoretical anymore. It's already in writing. Food producers have reportedly started sending official delay notices to major supermarket chains in St. Petersburg. One producer in Ulyanovsk told a retailer that deliveries could be delayed due to what they called force majeure, and asked to be excused from late delivery penalties. According to people watching this closely, the shortage doesn't hit all at once. It creeps. First, variety disappears. The fresh vegetables, milk, and eggs that depend most heavily on constant transport become harder to find. Then prices start climbing, one item at a time. That's already showing up in the official numbers. Between late May and early July, potato and onion prices jumped nearly 28%, and cabbage climbed almost 19%. For an ordinary family in Moscow, the monthly grocery bill has reportedly jumped from around 35,000 rubles to 43,000 rubles. The pressure got serious enough that the Kremlin sent formal warnings to more than 5,000 companies over price increases officials considered unjustified. And here's the twist. According to independent polling, the number one concern for ordinary Russians right now isn't the war, it's rising prices. But food isn't even the most dangerous cargo sitting in those stalled trucks. Medicine is. Russia imports almost all of its active pharmaceutical ingredients from abroad, mainly from China and India. Even before this fuel crisis, the country was already dealing with serious medication shortages. Everything from basic antibiotics to IV saline had become hard to find in pharmacies and hospitals. Now imagine that same fragile pharmaceutical pipeline depending on the same diesel-starved trucks that can't move food. Even if a drug successfully makes it into the country, it still has to travel from the port to a warehouse, from the warehouse to a hospital, and from the hospital to a patient. Every single step riding on a truck. And it's even worse for temperature-sensitive medications like insulin and vaccines, which need refrigerated trucks that, of course, also run on fuel. A single delay in that chain doesn't just mean a late delivery. It means a real patient somewhere not getting treatment on time. And then there's the front line. An army runs on exactly the same thing a country runs on, an uninterrupted supply chain. Ammunition, rations, spare parts, and above everything else, fuel. Ukraine has been deliberately targeting Russia's fuel and logistics vehicles, and by most accounts destroying them faster than Russia can replace them. Combine that with sanctions choking off military spare parts and Russia's ability to resupply its own forces, especially around Crimea and the southern front, is being stretched to its limit. While all of this is unfolding inside Russia, a parallel crisis is playing out across the Black Sea. Russia has ramped up missile strikes on Ukraine's key port infrastructure, hitting cities like Odessa and Mykolaiv. Sailors on commercial vessels have reportedly been killed in these strikes, and shipping companies are growing hesitant to send vessels anywhere near Ukrainian ports. War risk insurance premiums have spiked, some underwriters have simply stopped covering these routes altogether, and Odessa's storage capacity has dropped by nearly a third. Which raises an obvious question. Are we watching a rerun of 2022? Back then, when the Black Sea ports were blockaded, the entire world felt it. Grain prices spiked, global supply chains cracked, and the real problem wasn't a lack of grain, it was the inability to move it. But there's a key difference this time. The world has already lived through this exact scenario once, and it adapted. In 2022, when the Black Sea shut down, there was a scramble to find any alternative. Today, those alternatives already exist and are already running. The Danube River ports, Romania's Constanta port, expanding rail corridors. Even if shipping lanes were fully cut off tomorrow, there's now a tested backup system ready to absorb at least part of the shock. And farmers themselves are in a stronger position than they were back then. In 2022, cash-strapped farmers were forced to dump their harvests immediately at whatever price they could get, which crashed the market. This time, many producers are financially stable enough to simply store their grain and wait for better prices. So while the pattern echoes 2022, most analysts believe it likely won't become an exact repeat of that global catastrophe. So where does all of this leave Putin? Everything you've just heard points toward a regime backed into a corner. And yet, Putin is still holding real cards, and understanding them is the only way to understand why this crisis probably won't end the way you might expect. The first and most important question is simple. Could this actually boil over into an uprising? Most experts say no. Moscow-based political analyst Andrei Kolesnikov has pointed out that while war fatigue is slowly curdling into real public anger, that anger is unlikely to translate into mass protest, because inside a tightly controlled system like Russia's, there is simply no functioning mechanism for change, and the personal risk of trying to create one is enormous. So instead of resistance, what you're actually seeing is adaptation. Rather than taking to the streets, Russians are building crowdsourced digital maps showing which gas stations still have fuel, quietly helping each other route around the shortage instead of confronting it, and the state is actively encouraging exactly that kind of quiet coping. Officials are openly telling the public to simply get used to the new normal. Putin's second card is direct state intervention. The Kremlin moved fast, banning gasoline and diesel exports to preserve domestic supply and importing fuel from India, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to plug the gap. It even temporarily allowed the sale of lower-grade, non-standard fuel just to keep vehicles moving. None of it is a permanent fix, but it buys the regime time to manage the worst of the immediate pain. The third card is baked into the structure of the crisis itself. This isn't wiping out the trucking industry, it's brutally consolidating it. As small, fragile operators get pushed out of the market entirely, the massive logistics companies with deep capital reserves are relatively insulated and often even benefit from the shakeout, painful for small businesses, but stabilizing for the system as a whole, at least from the Kremlin's point of view. And the fourth card might be the most powerful one of all, the sheer cultural endurance of Russian society. This is a country whose collective memory includes far darker chapters. Kremlin-aligned media figure Margarita Simonyan has publicly invoked that history, reminding the public that earlier generations lived through times when even food was rationed by card, framing today's hardship as something to simply be endured the way it always has been. And history suggests that message genuinely resonates with a large part of Russian society. Put all four of those cards together: no organized opposition, a public choosing adaptation over confrontation, active state intervention, and a culture built around enduring hardship, and you get the real, unglamorous conclusion. This crisis, as severe as it is very unlikely to topple Putin anytime soon. But don't mistake not collapsing for not dangerous. The real story here was never a dramatic overnight implosion. It's something slower and in some ways scarier, a silent, grinding attrition, trucks stranded on frozen highways, farmers with sickles instead of combines, families in Moscow paying more every single month for less food, soldiers on the front line waiting on supply chains that keep getting hit before they arrive. None of it is loud enough to make global headlines every day. But add it all up, week after week, and you're watching a nation's internal machinery slowly seize up in real time. So here's the question worth sitting with. What happens to a war and a government when the country fighting it can no longer reliably move its own bread, its own medicine, or its own fuel? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the story unfolding on Russian highways right now, and it's one we'll be tracking closely. If you want to actually understand what's happening in Russia right now, not the state TV version, the real one, make sure you're subscribed to State's Report, because this story is far from finished, and we'll be here breaking down exactly what happens next. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think this crisis quietly reshapes Russia from the inside, or does the Kremlin manage to hold the line? Let us know below, and we'll see you in the next one.